And so the goal of superhero therapy is to help clients to become a version of a superhero in real life. And so one of the things I like to ask my clients is, if you were to become a superhero in real life, what kind of a superhero would you be? What kind of superpowers would you want to help, and how would you want to help people? And most people initially think of something fantastical. So they might say, well, I would want to be able to fly around the world, or have the strength of Superman, or have the money that Batman had. But when I would ask them what they would do with it, most people would say that they would support different charities, or they would show up for people who were in danger, or support their friends and family members, or support strangers who are suffering. And we don't need superpowers to do that, not fictional superpowers anyway, only the superpower of kindness. And so through these connections with fictional characters, many people develop essentially a role model to guide them through this process, which we'll talk about in a little bit. They are less ashamed about their experiences, and they're able to find their sense of purpose, which again helps them with determining their post-traumatic growth and starting that heroic journey. It is meant to be for people of all ages. So despite how the name might come across, some people think superhero therapy is just for children, but actually this work started with active duty service members who were adults. It is now utilized all over the world for people of all ages for a variety of different diagnoses, from post-traumatic stress disorder to anxiety and depression and chronic illness, reduction of addiction-like behaviors, and a number of other individuals. There was a comment where one of the individuals shared that they've done something similar with anime. I'm really glad to hear. And the idea is that there are so many things that we can do with this kind of work. And if you remember nothing else from our lecture today, from our webinar today, please just remember this one slide. You don't have to be the expert in pop culture to do this work. You don't have to know anything about superheroes or anime or manga or video games. Your client is the expert. The only thing you have to be is open-minded and curious. The idea is that we can help the clients to find their own community, whether it's a community of people in real life, or maybe a virtual community, or even a connection with a fictional character where the client feels less alone in their experience and more seen and understood. And so I want to show you how this works by sharing a case study with you. So a few years ago, I was teaching a course on superhero therapy at Alliance International University in San Diego. And this was a course for graduate level students who were studying to become therapists. And so every week we would talk about a different element of pop culture. So we would talk about, for example, Star Wars one week and Harry Potter another week, etc. And we would talk about mental health themes in each of these franchises. And majority of the students were pretty familiar with, at the very least, Western pop culture, and some students were not. And there were also some students who were immigrants. And so there was one student who was from Kenya. Let's call him Mark. That's not his name. So Mark hadn't previously learned much about American superheroes, and so a lot of these were new to him. So one week we talked about the Avengers. And in case you're not familiar, Avengers are superheroes from the Marvel universe. So there is Iron Man and Black Widow and Black Panther and Thor. And so we talked about some mental health themes in some of the Avengers films. And the following week, Mark started his first clinical practicum, where he was assigned his first ever clinical case, his first client. So Mark had no clinical experience, was new to superheroes, and his first ever client was a 15-year-old girl who was in a foster care system, who was essentially going from foster care to foster care, and she'd been kicked out of multiple high schools. And when she first met Mark, she folded her arms and she said, "I don't want to work with you." It wasn't clear why, maybe because he was a little bit older, maybe because he was wearing a suit. I'm not exactly sure why, but I think for one reason or another, she assumed that he wouldn't understand her. And so Mark said, that's fine. If you don't want to work with me, that's okay. But would you give me just one chance, right? One session. And if you don't want to work with me after that, I will help you to transfer to another provider. And she said, okay. So I'm guessing that she expected Mark to ask her why she was in trouble at school, but she wasn't, or at the very least, he didn't ask her that. He asked her, tell me about yourself. He said, what kind of books, movies, or TV shows or video games do you like? And she thought about it and she said, well, I like Ant-Man. Now, we didn't talk about Ant-Man in class when we talked about the Avengers. There was no time to talk about every single Avenger there is. And so Mark had no idea who Ant-Man was. So he simply asked, he said, who's Ant-Man? And his client said, well, he's the superhero. He's one of the Avengers. And Mark said, oh, yeah, I know a little bit about the Avengers. I know there's Thor and Black Widow. And she lit up. She was so happy just that he knew that much. And she said, yeah, and Ant-Man is one of them. So Mark said, tell me about Ant-Man. I want to know. And so she said, well, Ant-Man is the superhero who has this superpower. So he can make himself really, really small, like the size of an ant. And Mark said, do you ever wish that you had that superpower, that you could make yourself really, really small, like the size of an ant? And she said, yeah, all the time. She said that she feels like everywhere she goes, the eyes are on her, that people are constantly waiting to either start a fight with her or get her in trouble or yell at her or criticize her. And she wished that she could not quite disappear, but hide and have a little bit of relief. And Mark said, yeah, that makes sense. I get that. And so he said, tell me about some of the times where that happened. And so she did. And then he said, what would you do if you had that superpower? And so she told him, and he said, what would you do if you could join the Avengers? And she told him. And so they spent the whole session talking. And at the end of the session, she requested to only work with him. Now, I think that's a really successful first ever session, right? He never had any clinical experience. He knew nothing about Ant-Man. But he was able to build rapport with his client simply by asking her about her passions and then learning her language, her vocabulary to understand her.